cooking. So, how's everyone doing? Tip top.
Good.
Good. And to today's session, as I said in the invite, we are going to talk about new strategies to do sort of UI in other ways than we have been before. I guess let me share my screen and get started straight away. And feel free to break in with questions, of course, as always. You see my screen now? Yeah. Going to... Yeah, maybe we have it like that. So... UI. It's hasn't been our primary focus when it comes to catching complex things. We have focused on the gist and the information side of the things and the modernity to actually get it to run and always behave correctly. That has been the MDriven primarily focus. And then we have said for many years now that fashion is fashion and it's hard to predict, and you probably want to do 5 to 10% of your signature UIs that's really gonna hit the home run to the audience manually, and we have provided ways to do that manually with like tag expander and view override, etc., to make it easier for you to wire it your own. But still, as soon as you wire something without support from the framework, it's a lot of work, and it really slows down your progress and your evolution process, because whenever something is sort of dependent on another thing that changes, things start to break, and UIs that you have hand wired will break sooner or later because of changes that you do in the gist. And we're all about doing it the best way possible and the easiest way. And as fashion has been a low priority, it's maybe starting to get back as a higher priority for us, since this is where we have the bottlenecks in development. That's at least a working hypothesis. And also we have been looking and trying to understand, are there rules to making a good UI? Rules that can be declarative, described, or is it just pixel fixing here and there, or are there truly rules? And we think that there's starting to emerge rules on how people do good UIs, and we have been studying that and trying to mimic how can we get hold of those things that they do. And let's see how we're going to start. Going to take up a ViewModel editor, and just going to do a new ViewModel that's based on thing, and let's just go for UI first and do copy out the form for document. So that's how We have been working with a fixed grid where you put in the information where is something's gonna show, and this of course gives, it's very easy and straightforward. Everything has a given place, but it's also very rigid, and well, it works well with large administrative data heavy systems, but maybe not if you want to do UIs that work on different form factors, etc. So what we wanted to do was actually to sort of a mix of the group boxes where you can put things together, and as a UI gets less and less space, things should fold and should follow. And there's a thing on the web called Flexbox that's really good on this, and it's a mature widget in HTML, and sort of wanted to do the same for all our modernity engines, at least for VPF and for HTML, so that we can continue in the same fashion that we have been doing. So we started to look into if that was possible, and if it was possible to make use of that, how are we supposed to get them into place here? Let's see if I have. So this is has a class action show thing. Let's call this. So if I were to run this now, I would see something like no, that's not the one, that's the one, like this. So this UI is sort of very fixed. It won't fold anywhere, and we really need to explain to the rendering engine how we want this to behave. What we did was to, and this is still work in progress, so we're far from done, but I think it's far along to show anyway.
Can I add in there, Hans?
Yes.
And it's also important to realize that it doesn't work really to say that, well, this is just old and then just everything should be super flexible, because there are a lot of situations where you actually want some kind of rigidity, like an address input block or things. So we needed, the goal here is to like make both things work together, both rigid when you want X and Y alignment, and other areas where you don't want it. So we can't just throw out all that we had, because it actually has many use cases that are valid. So please go on, Hans.
Yeah. So we have introduced a thing we called PlacingContainer. So basically what we can do is add a PlacingContainer, which is a new thing that we haven't had before. Once we have a PlacingContainer, we can add things into that PlacingContainer to say that these things should be in the PlacingContainer. And I'm gonna go ahead and just add all the things here that were outside of the PlacingContainer, just to see what happens when we do this. Well, what's silly many things here. So now I've added all the things into the PlacingContainer. And what happened on the UI was that everything was rendered along a row like this. So if I were to switch to the application and refresh this, this is of course one way to render a UI. It's not very practical, but it follows the idea of a box that's a row. And when I click the row, I can switch that to, maybe I don't want it to be a row, maybe it should be a column instead. Column meaning going from top to bottom. And then it would switch like that. And if I were to refresh that, I get a UI that looks like this. And still no big difference compared to what we have had before. It's uglier and it's not aligned, etc. But those are actually rules on the placing container. So how should I justify, or how should I align items within this column? So I can align them on like stretch. That would mean that all these would stretch along the thought of column. And what I also can do is tell them to wrap. If the column is too tight and not everything will fit, then it should wrap. So I'm going to say that as well. So all these settings are actually not invented by us in any way. They are plainly, proudly stolen from Flexbox. And so now the UI looks like this, and ideally I would like it to wrap. Maybe I have a hard time with the data grid because that's hogging up the space, but there's a sweet spot there. Yeah, so let's see if we can get that to actually do its thing. I think it's mainly depending on these data grid here. I haven't fully solved that it still acts as it did before to follow along. But that leads me into a good reason to mention that these placing containers. So now we have this data grid here, for example, the details and the multi-value pick. We can actually add a placing container on those as well. And then it starts to sort of be something completely different, because what we normally do with the grids or tables in the old UI renderer was always to get a data grid. And we have had problem with doing a sort of a list box with actual editable controls in them, or images in them, or something like that. And we think that this is sort of a remedy for that. I'm going to do this on both these grids, I think, to see what happens. So it's interesting to notice that this way of building a UI is actually harder, because it's not necessarily that you see exactly what you get. You need to, and we're going to work on that, but one need to be able to actually resize to see what happens with the UI in different situations. Actually, I did it this wrong. We're gonna need two placing containers for the grids. Why do we need two? I'm gonna tell you. The first one, the outer one, is how the actual grid itself is handled, and the inner one is how each child item within it is handled. So we're going to see an effect on this once we are able to move this in here like this. And if I now refresh this, I can see that this actually I'm going to remove these buttons because they seem to confuse more than I think. I haven't tried with buttons. So this grid is actually doing a long row of things here. So I can, maybe it's read only now. Let's go back and see this attribute 1. It's read only. I'm going to remove that and model refresh. And now I can write stuff in these. But why is it looking like that? Well, the row details, it's set to build act as a row, and the inner items should also be rows. I think it's more appropriate that the outer container should be a column. And save and refresh. So now the outer container is a column, so these are the rows. And what we want to do, and since we said that it should wrap, if it doesn't fit, it will move up to a new position, and it should, I guess this one has no data in it, so it's not measured. So how come there's only one attribute here then? Let's see. One would think that there would be multiple attributes. Not sure about that. So
maybe they're all stacking on top of each other.
I think that's just a row. It should be okay. What you can do on this row that shows them all is to justify the content to space around. I'm just thinking, why is this so tiny? It's a column. It has stretch. Something to do with the not sure. Let's see, I'm gonna do this one as a column as well to see if that is the one that misbehaves. Where do we want? Gonna hit back here and model refresh. So there should be room here to do more stuff. Where is it? what you can do on, yeah, maybe it's so that if we don't have any data, it shrinks. So if we were to set the margins or the minimum width of something, not the margin, so could be that. Not sure actually. That was strange. Let's go back, and if I go into the debugger from here and look at the details and have a seeker for those. Well, there is data in attribute 2 and 3. Okay, that's a bit of a mystery for me. We're gonna not to get stuck on this mishap. I'm gonna switch to a different kind of another view model.
Just wonder if you change the order for the columns, will the first one be shown but the other ones will be hidden?
Like that. So now it's attribute 2 anyway, but I'm not sure why.
Still confused.
Still confused. So this is a row. What if I were to set that as a column as well? Then it would be a column within a column. It's still not doing the thing that I assumed that it would do. Not at all. Sure why. I'm just going to test to switch this to grid, because when I set it to grid, I have concluded that a good way would be to render it as a plain list box, but that doesn't behave either. So it might be some late change that I've done that confused this. So let's move on and look at this one. This is more or less the same thing, but focus on combo boxes or switchers, because before having the idea of a placing container, there was really no good way to have more data in a single picker. You could just pick one text, but what if you were able to do, let's see, hope this works then, so I haven't destroyed anything. So this is called view one thing 2. So now I'm able to do a thing like having a text and an image within the picker, and we haven't been able to do that before because we haven't known how to describe that particular scenario. It hasn't been any way to say that, well, you can have multiple attributes and they're gonna stack up in a row, and once you pick one, it should switch to show that one in the picker. So this is a direct effect of being able to say that all the items are gonna list up in a column, and that's the pop-up. This is the column, and then within the column each item is gonna be a row. And you notice the different shades of gray that we have here. That's just me having added that to make it a bit more shaded gray to distinguish the different levels of placing containers. So that's gonna disappear in the end. what this means is that one can actually do any number of complexities within a picker all of a sudden. So now I said that the image should have a max size of 30. What if I said that there is no max size? Currently you need to set it to 0 to indicate that there is no max size. How would that be? Well, the banana is quite big, but still it would be okay, and the orange is like that. So since there's no limitation anyway in the UI, this is the effect. And since there's no limitation, currently this is limited because it's within a fixed box. Since there is no limitations, we need to be able to set the max and minimum on each column in the end. So that's why we had to introduce that. But that gives us quite a good extension of what's possible to do with the simple UI. So this can be a standard UI in every aspect. This is the standard grid placed UI, but we have used the placing columns within the nestings to make things happen there. That's one way of getting use of this new strategies. Let's see if there's one thing that I should test on the one that I did, or maybe we should switch to the original one I had here. So this is more like what I wanted to show. We have a let's see what we have. This is the view one thing. This is the one. It starts with a row. So a row is something that goes in the X direction, and that has two attributes or two columns, this one and this one. Why are they so far apart? Well, it's because the row has the space between property set on it. Maybe it should have start instead. Then everything will be aligned to start. Maybe it should have the space around. Then it will be space evenly distributed between them. But this also has another row within it that actually should fit up here. But since this row has wrap on it, it wraps around and continues over here. So I guess if I'm on this first row and checks out the wrap, it will jump up there, and then there is no space for these first two to distribute, so everything is too tight. So that's what I mean, that we need some new way to be able to say how large the UI really should be, or to test it in different scenarios. So if it looks like this and I were to model refresh it, everything is along this row, this initial row. These two are on the first one, and then we have another row within it, and these things are within that, and that probably wraps as well because this one starts over here. I guess if I were to do this longer, it would jump up here. And here at least we see the effect of having a the other thing that I wanted to show on the other one, it's this one called details, and it goes down to grid, row, and showing the 3 attributes. So if I were to add detail, this one would grow in that direction, and this one would also grow in that direction. So these are just, and this is also an example of that you can have live controls within the picker. So now we can actually change stuff that were only placed there for able to pick them. So that's also an effect of enabling this extra freedom. So this is all cool and everything, but is it usable? I think that what the holy grail with the UIs that's gonna work on mobile phone, etc., is this setup that I have here. It might not look as much, but what everyone strives for is to be able to have one header that's fixed, that you have control over, and one footer that you have control over. And when the things get tight, you want the middle to scroll. So this is what everyone, this is the major thing for mobile UIs, to be to own the footer and to own the header. So how was this achieved? View one thing with scrolling middle. So currently this is doesn't show at all because I forced it to be very small, but this is how it looks. It starts with one column, and that's the column that has the complete UI, and within that column we have one row which is the header row, and that is but I'm not going to say anything about that. And then we have yet another row which has the details grid within it, and this is the scrolling one. How does it know that this should scroll and not the last one, which is the footer? Yes, so in this column there are actually 3 items: this row, and this row. And how does it know which one to scroll? And that comes down to a property of anything in the flexboxes called grow. So grow is something you set on a thing that you want to is allowed to grow relative to other things. If you want it to have a fixed size, you just leave the grow to 0 or 1 actually, and not bigger than 1. But if you want it to grow, you can set it to a integer number. So suppose you have multiple things that you want to grow, and you want them to grow in different speeds, so to speak. That one is going to grow, should be always bigger than the other one that grows. Then you would set the integers, the smaller one to 2 and the bigger one to 4. Then it would evenly distribute, so that one is always double to the other one. If you want them to grow at equal pace, then you should set them to the same number. So this is
okay,
a way.
so, sorry, to be clear, that It's proportional relative to those integers rather
Yes.
than this one grows first, then that one grows second.
Yes. So within the calculation, we do look at them both and look at the available space and distribute it according to how much of the total integer weight that you owe. So when it comes to this scrolling variant of the details, I've set that to a grid which forces it to use the list box that has the scroll bar. So what happens here was that it was a scroll bar, and that might be what you want, but at the same time maybe not. Maybe this should be set to being a column that has wrapping on it. And what does that mean then? So instead of scrolling, it should wrap. So when things get tight, start to do this. And this is something that you can use, for example, if you have a grid of images that you want someone to pick between. It would be a good way to display them in a flexbox like this, spreading over the screen. And why are they distributed like this? Maybe it's not to your liking. Well, then it's back to the properties of this particular column, that it was set to have space around, but maybe we actually want it to be around start. And then be more like this. So just stealing everything that Flexbox enables a UI specialist doing HTML are able to do if they know their stuff. We think that that's a good strategy to introduce much more complex UI within the declarative approach. But we still need to introduce these extra settings. We haven't found the ending of the settings yet. We're going to have expressions for setting styles on both the boxes and the columns. We already have styles on, of course, but definitely on the boxes, to be able to color them and to frame them and to do things like that. We're also going to set expressions for having visibility on the boxes, the placing containers. So, and if that were the case, one can imagine when focusing one row like this, that it turns into something else. Because when the visible expression is looking at vCurrent, it might say that the vCurrent, if this is the vCurrent row, it should display these controls instead of the current ones. So that would leave room for making a grid like this, having static columns until you select the row, then it turns into editable columns. And we think that's going to be pretty cool to make live changes to the UI without resorting to tag expander or doing everything yourself. So this is just about how far we have come with this. We're far from done, but we think it's good to start the discussion on where this is taking us and what the effects will be. And of course, it doesn't look any good right now because these are all jammed up and different heights. Well, that's an effect of not having the grid that's gonna drag things out. But then we have introduced things as the margins to make it possible to make things to grow in certain directions, etc.
And Hans, if I interject now, so of course CSS will be part of the web, at least for this. I don't know exactly how it's going to be in BPF, but I mean you can apply styles to margins and things like that from CSS to make it nicer. The main point is that I would like to go back just to point out, as Hans said, this is not invented here, but Hans has implemented all this in the designer to basically control two features of the web browser, the Flexbox and the CSS grid. So both of them. And you didn't show that much of CSS grid, but if, for example, in the last example here, each of those blocks could have been a CSS grid structure. So if you want rigidity for, let's take my date input again. So if you had a lot of dates on the screen, you could have a grid inside all these flex things. So then these blocks of addresses would flow and adapt to the screen. So all this is basically boxes or containers in containers in containers in containers. And if you think about it, each container just adds more information about the context of data. Because if you go all the way back to Bootstrap, which was like, whoa, we can do everything. The problem with it was that it was actually a rigid structure that had two modes, really. Either it was the full screen or everything just mashed together into one vertical column on a cell phone. And so, and then from there, the last 10 years, the web browser developers added Flexbox and then CSS Grid. And now there is really a good way to add all this layout data. And now when Hans has implemented all these features in the designer, it brings this whole way of describing a flexible UI into the designer. We have done this, painstakingly, and Alex has done a lot of it. Every time you design something, you need to do all this manually. But then, of course, you get back to this problem of data binding. And in this way, you capture it all in one thing without breaking what Hans has been always, saying, that we can't just put unstructured things. It needs to have a very, very clear idea on how it will work, and it needs to work over multiple platforms. But this seems to be something that can be implemented in all, but there are mostly two today, right? There's Windows VPF or another Windows way. There are the web browser, and if there's something on an Android phone or an iPhone, we are confident that they will fall into the same way of adding information about foldability in UIs. So, I think this will just blow ourselves away in flexibility when it comes to building a new type of UIs. Then it will probably need 6 months or a year to fully stabilize. But I hope to have this running so that it can be used with some tweaking in autumn, and then maybe more fully without that much, hands-on tweaking not that long after it, because it will open up a huge new world when it comes to MDriven designer helping you to understand. But it has the same steep learning curve, you could say, as modeling. If you look at the people that complain about UML models, they're so difficult to understand. Yeah, because they're declarative. The same thing with SQL the first time I learned it. It's like, but this is awkward way of describing it, because you need to describe something as a rule, not as do this first, do that then, and do this the third. And this is the same way. Here you have to tweak the rules and then look at the outcome.
Yeah. So, and what's good about our approach here is that it builds on everything that we have done before. It's just yet another descriptive layer within the declarative view model that you can use. You don't have to use it. So initially, and for sure, all the simple UIs, that's going to be value store editors or administrative UIs to fetch information on a single form factor screen. You don't have to bother to do those foldable. But then you have this signature UI that would be nice if it actually could be added in a good way, declarative, so you don't need to have anything platform specific outside of the model. And I think this will do just that.
As we started out this, I pointed to Hans and said that the current view model is just that there's one big container for the whole screen that is set to grid. So if you think of it, the existing one is one big container and it has the grid setting. So what you could basically do is that you take stuff out of that and you make smaller grids and you put them in a big grid. That would be one way to color them different or turn them on and off and things. And then you can say, hey, now I have 4 big blocks on my screen in my admin UI. Well, let's put the container, the big one, as filling the screen like this. Then if you stretch your screen very far, they will all be, 4 will be after each other. If you squeeze the screen like on a cell phone, they will all be stacked on top of each other. So one way to navigate or go away or rework your UIs would be to contextually cut them into pieces and then put them so that they can wrap underneath each other and flow like that. That would be one way to take on. If you have a system with a huge amounts of existing view models, that would be the way maybe to start subdividing and getting your system to be more flexible without going full, cell phone.
It's good. I like it. I have a couple of questions. Currently, I mean, some of this functionality if you implemented it, had to be implemented obviously on outside, but it did kind of get me in the mode of accessing the various grids and elements that get translated in a WPF environment anyway, either by using the view model, layout grid, and or the various spawned artifacts that you can come by with during on apply UI on column UI apply style. Presumably with these placed containers, placing containers, you're going to have access. You're still going to have stylability access to those things, but just probably they have different spawned names or different
Correct.
all different things within the layout grid.
Yes, correct. So there's more or less exactly the same. There's one issue with the list boxes or things that multiply, because now we introduce this is the same definition. There's only one definition of this row, but the row exists in multiple instances. So there's a limitation on where to put the definition, because once you see the definition, you see it in this is the view model declaration, and as this will be instantiated multiple times. Before we had the data grid, and that was still just one time. so it was the data grid, and then you were left on your own to handle the rows. Now we do the rows as well, or we give you control over the rows, what you want to show in. So it's a bit different, but more or less the same, and totally available to navigate both the visual trees in VPF and also the definition trees in the ViewModel.
I assume regular sort of 1, 2, 3 plus 1,000 row grids you're going to want to stick with.
Yeah, so the data grid is
for performance reasons.
Yeah, it's good, but it has served its purpose very well, and it will serve its purpose very well in the future as well. But all of a sudden you want a list of fruits, images of fruits that you want to, well, it should scroll if it needs to, but there should be no scroll bar if it doesn't have to, and it should fill the screen as much as possible, and that's not the data grid. That's not something that you want to have columns on top and sort and maybe edit. It's something else, and it's good to be able to declare what it is then, if it isn't a data grid. So what you could do with this UI is to say that maybe it shouldn't use the placing columns. So we delete the placing or the placing containers. Delete that one. And then it turns into a data grid again, because then we haven't said anything. All the columns are on the top level. And then it would look like it did before for that one. Not sure how it behaves now. Yeah, it should. There's a minimum height on it.
About actions, in the data grid you have the context menu showing all the actions, or on right click.
Yeah, so it's over here and over here, and of course if we go here and press Ctrl+Z to put them back and refresh. Oh, I know what this is. And there's a caching mechanism, and it doesn't discover the placing containers. I just changed the name on that one.
This hasn't been implemented yet for the web, so that work will start soon.
So it's.
But I guess we'll have the menus and all there as the same.
Yeah, so that's on the virtual to-do list, I guess, to get the actions to listen on the selection here as well. But at least the current variables are updated correctly. So
would you say we can start playing with this now, or is it a bit soon?
Yeah, it's for playing. It's absolutely available because that's the only way we know how to work to make everything in the continuous delivery. But to trust it, to really depend on it in production, it's too early. And it's too early. But it will be there. And of course, if you play with it, it's always welcome to get your feedback on how it behaves and things like that. Because even if there's a finite set of settings, the combinations pretty fast get towards infinity, because you can have as many placing containers nested in any way you want and how many you want in a single view model. So there's room for messing up.
But we don't
Thinking
think
about maybe if you create a nice, for example, a card, one type for a product or something, and you want to reduce that because maybe it's a pretty much nesting with columns and rows and columns and rows, and you have a template that here goes an image, here goes a heading, info text, blah 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 blah.
Yeah, so currently we don't have any built-in functionality with except for the snippets, and the snippets has been sadly underused. It's a great thing to use to anything that's repetitive and complex and template like. You do a snippet and then you just apply the snippet and you fill in the variables that you have said are part of the snippet to give it unique names. So that's, I don't really believe in there's always this divide between what is a copy and paste and what is a reuse definition, or what is the same definition. And there's a sweet spot where copy and paste is just better. Like for text, you always use copy and paste. You wouldn't say, I have my favorite saying that's in this document, and I want to have a reference to that from that document into this document to instead of just copying the text. So it's how much value does the definition have. And I think these kinds of things that goes into UI, where they might start out the same, but they don't need to evolve in the same direction, should be copy and paste. That's my personal view, but coming from the 80s and 90s, everything should be reference. So let's take some, you have to pick a side.
We hope that the implementation in the web UI shouldn't be that difficult. At least we hope so, because we have copied the ideas from basically the layout of the web engine. So, but you never know. So let's see where we get with it. And in the beginning, of course, it will be slightly more difficult to use than later. So early adopters always have more pain, but maybe more to gain.
Yeah, so that's today's show.
Yeah, great.
And as I said in the invite, I think this is we will take a break now for the summers, and we will focus on getting some sun and getting some alone time with the computer. So
Exactly. We'll need alone time with our computers. We have had too little of it during winter. But yeah, it's always fun to have some extra a dear project during summer. So I hope you all have it.
yeah, so thanks for showing up tonight, and see you in the autumn.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks, Antti.
Thanks.
Good.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.